happens to students when they have a learning difficulty or disability in reading? Students become hindered in their academic performance and experience frustration and anxiety. Students who struggle with reading have problems understanding and interpreting what they read. They have problems decoding and fail to make connections between what they read and what they know, and often lack sufficient vocabulary. What does the research tell us about reading difficulties? Since 2000, researchers have outlined 5 key components of effective reading programs that are not only beneficial to students with learning difficulties in reading, but to all students. These are phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Research suggests that these components should not only be taught explicitly, but should be systematic and sequential. Cognitive science findings on how the brain learns to process written language suggest that both decoding and comprehension processes are necessary for reading success. These findings support earlier findings such as Goff and Turner's simple view of reading. Reading difficulties may also occur when students lack motivation, so this particular area must also be considered. How to best teach students with learning difficulties in reading has been a subject of debate for decades. So, what is this debate all about? It's between supporters of the whole language approach and the explicit instruction approach. When students are introduced to language through context, it is known as the whole language approach. This approach assumes that all students will acquire elements of reading through exposure, with some but not a lot of explanation. Conversely, the explicit instruction model demands systematic and methodological instruction and is argued to be the best way to teach students with learning difficulties in reading. Recent studies and findings support this view of the necessity for explicit instruction. Findings from the National Inquiry into Teaching of Literacy suggest that explicit instruction is beneficial for students with reading difficulties, as found strong evidence that the whole language approach to the teaching of reading on its own is not the best interest of children, particularly those experiencing reading difficulties. Explicit teaching reading skills would meet the disability standards for education. Curriculum legislates that all students with a disability are able to participate on the same basis as their peers through rigorous, meaningful, dignified learning programs. By understanding the difficulty, how do we identify it? Teachers must use different methods to identify learning difficulties in reading, particularly in the early years. Simple observations and anecdotal notes are often the first way that difficulties are observed. But that is not enough. Students may show evidence of frustration with reading tasks, become distracted during reading activities, lack confidence in their reading ability, or become discouraged with their lack of success. Teachers can use informal tests such as running records, knowledge of high-frequency words, and determinants of students' reading levels. Formal diagnostic tests such as Spelfabet and probe reading assessments can also be used as a tool to identify learning difficulties in reading. A useful foundation called Spelled provides other useful assessment resources that teachers would find beneficial. After formal and diagnostic testing, strategies for the 5 key elements must be used in a systematic, explicit, and intensive way. A 3-tier model of reading instruction response to intervention is an important model to use. The first tier demands explanatory quality initial instruction for all students. The second tier is aimed at the bottom 20% of students. These students participate in more intensive intervention. The third tier intervention is for those students who are still struggling in reading and need one-to-one intensive reading instruction. As well as teaching strategies, appropriate teaching styles must be used for students with learning difficulties. So what are the best strategies teachers can use? There are many evidence-based strategies for helping students with learning difficulties. First element of effective reading instruction is phonemic awareness, which is the ability to hear sounds in spoken words, realization that words have a sequence of sound, understanding the relationship between speech and print, along with the way letters are represented by sounds. Phonemic awareness is one of the key elements that must be explicitly taught. Following the Rose Review in the United Kingdom, the use of systematic phonics has become more widely used. It is systematic and sequential, and research has demonstrated is beneficial for students with reading difficulty. Fluency is another element of reading that has 3 dimensions: accuracy in word decoding, automaticity, and prosody. Teaching strategies include moral oral reading, repeated reading, and independent silent reading. The importance of directly teaching vocabulary is well established. Even though vocabulary is also learned indirectly, strategies include how to use word part, for example, suffix, and how to use context clues to determine word meaning. Regular exposure to new vocabulary is also important. Reading comprehension needs to be explicitly taught so that students are able to recognize the words on the page, assign meaning to each word, arrange words in sentences, and then retain the information while reading sentences. The use of comprehension monitoring is a strategy where students are taught to understand where in the text they find difficult to understand. The use of graphic and semantic organizers is a strategy to assist students develop representations of information in the text through graphs and maps. Question answering allows students to answer teacher-led questions to gain deeper understanding of text. Question generating is another strategy where the students can think of their own questions. Early intervention and explicit systematic and sequential teaching of the 5 elements of reading will not only benefit students with learning difficulties in reading, but to all students.